So we're here again now with a conversation with the editor, which is a way that we like to bring the content of the current issue of the magazine to life for you off the page. And this is our current issue. It's the May-June issue, which, if you can see the title, it's called Threshold Places. We're looking there at the major transitions that we go through as individuals, that we go through collectively, that the planet goes through. Really, really wonderful celebration of all those things. But tucked away towards the back of the magazine in our review section, we have a review of a brand new, relatively new actually, podcast. So the podcast is a collaboration between our guest this morning, Emma Newman, and Friends of the Earth. The review, just to give her credit, is by Gwen Peters, and I really love this review because what she describes in just 4 words is the concept of this podcast, when she says it's all about small but mighty wins, and we will come back to that and talk about that a bit more with Emma. So we're going to jump straight in and meet Emma, who is going to tell us a little bit about her work as a science fiction writer. So this really caught my attention. I'm so interested in a storyteller with an eye on kind of future possibilities, looking at the challenges that we're facing, and then talking to people in real time about kind of efforts that they're making to show solutions, etc. Emma, are you with us?
I am. Thank you for speaking to me today.
It's really, really lovely to meet you. Thank you for finding the time. So, Emma, I'm wondering, will you tell us, let's start with the science fiction writing part of things. I know you've written a lot of books. But, will you tell us a little bit how that started for you? And then I have a specific question about that, but I'm going to wait until you've told us a little bit more.
So yes, my, I guess, main job, if there is such a thing anymore, I do several jobs, as we do in the creative arts now, is as an author. And the most recent series I've had published is the Planetfall series. And that's set about 80 years in the future. And they're all standalone novels. The first one is on a distant planet that is being colonized in a very different way. And then the rest are set on Earth, on Mars, and in space. And it's very, very much an expression of the absolute rage I've been feeling for so many years about effectively the systemic injustices that exist within society. And what I wanted to do was to show how bad it will get if we don't change things now. And to put that into context, when I first started writing the series, this was pre-Trump, pre-2016, pre-Brexit. And the thing that got me really thinking about the destruction of the planet and of society in terms of corporate interests was something called the TTIP, which was a transatlantic international treaty. And it was effectively going to give corporations the right to sue governments for restricting access to resources like, fresh water, for example. And I was reading about this and thinking, this is appalling and terrifying, and I kind of wanted to grab readers by the shoulders and kind of shake them and say, look at what we're doing now. This is what you're going to get. This is how awful it is going to be. So that's where it started.
Okay. And I'm wondering, how do you take care of yourself in the mix of all that? Because that is taking on, I feel like I'm talking to an individual who's taking on an awful lot on behalf of all of us, and especially those who aren't taking any of it on. How do you take care of yourself, Emma, in that mix?
Incredibly badly, which is kind of it's the story of how I got to this podcast, because I guess this podcast kind of grew out of a kind of an existential crisis, both as just a person and as a writer. Because after a very horrible few years, just, generally globally, we've experienced the pandemic, but in my personal life as well, I've had a huge amount of trauma and upheaval. And I was thinking about the things that I'd been writing, and science fiction is a very interesting genre because it's effectively a conversation that spans decades. And when you look at the history of science fiction, you're looking at the history of people of the 20th century and onwards. And you can look at each decade and look at the fears of the writers and how they're explored. And I had done exactly the same thing. But then I was thinking, I think I want to contribute something different to the conversation. I think for my own personal mental health, I need to start looking at the good in the world, because there are so many wonderful things happening, but I was so focused on my fear. And what I thought was, actually, I need to start focusing on what is good, what is hopeful, and what is plausible, because science fiction can often fall into a trap of saying, especially in golden age science fiction, which is like the 1950s, it's like, technology is going to come and save the day, jazz hands. And then we kind of grew up in the genre, and then there's been a lot of fiction about how it's going to destroy us. And I wanted to write something in a different direction. I wanted to write something utopian that was realistic, that was based in where we are today, how we can get somewhere better. So I started to work on that, and then ground to a halt and thought, I can't imagine this. And I do not have a lack of imagination. I've had 11 books published and multiple short stories. I have a surfeit of imagination. Why can I not write a plausible utopian story? And that led to conversations with a dear friend of mine who works at Friends of the Earth, as I was kind of exploring what to do next. And I came up with this idea of trying to kind of look at the influence of science fiction, looking at technology, but it not being the savior, and it actually being people, rooted in people and community. And that's the kind of future that I wanted to create. But I didn't know how to do it. And from that conversation, it suddenly turned into an idea for a podcast. And then it was like, well, I could help Friends of the Earth. If I make this, I can hopefully get different people. My audience is very different, and there is overlap. As I've heard from my readers and my listeners, some of them are already very much involved in the environmental movement, but there are a lot who aren't. And I was thinking I could bring those people in, and the Friends of the Earth audience are very, unlikely, a large proportion of them to have ever heard of my work, because science fiction is a very niche genre. And so this cross-pollination of ideas is what led to the podcast, and each episode encapsulates that. And I just kind of wanted to help everybody, to showcase the people doing amazing things, to lift them up, to raise their profile, but also to engender hope and have that as a way to cope with, because I'm not the only person who feels like they're carrying all of this on their shoulders, and to help other people.
We did a theme at the end of last year, the November, December issue last year, which was entirely dedicated to navigating, we called it climate anxiety. But yeah, they were quite hard pieces to read, some of those pieces. But I really love what you've just shared, because for me, I'm like, oh yes, that's how the two came together. But of course, I've forgotten to say what the name of the podcast is. That's what you've just described. It's called Imagining Tomorrow. And so you are bringing all your creativity and your imagining, and then you're talking to people, aren't you, about technology and community action, and the two coming together to make a real difference, which is where the small but mighty wins phrase came from, the person, Gwen, who was doing the review. So I'm wondering, how do you set about finding those people? How do you make those matches? How does that all work behind scenes?
So one of the things that's an important part of being a science fiction author is when you're world building for a fictional piece, it's looking at a particular change, and sometimes it can only be one thing that changes that has a ripple effect to create a very different kind of future or a different setting. And so I was employing that technique of looking at the one thing that could change. And that's where the small but mighty comes in, because the idea of the podcast, when I was just kind of looking around and researching, and I read very widely. I read a lot of science journals and publications, again, as part of my work. And I also, I'm in the middle of a transition in my life of moving to a very different kind of lifestyle. So I'm researching a lot of environmental, sustainable building, all kinds of things. So I was already very plugged into kind of the ecosystem in a way. And I would just find little nuggets, I guess like a magpie, looking for shiny things and taking them back to the mental nest. And so when I found something where I thought, that is a really interesting thing, that is that one small change that if it was scaled up, my goodness, what a difference that could make, which is exactly what world building is. So I was world building based on real world things, and the start of every episode of Imagining Tomorrow has like a 2 to 4 minute long tiny snippet of fiction which helps people to imagine what that change, what that world could look like if those changes have been put into place. So I'm bringing in the science fiction in that aspect. But then each interview, there's one with a community or an individual that's doing something wonderful. There's a technology innovator. And then the third interview that goes into each episode is with one of my science fiction author friends, peers, where I give them the resources that the interviews that I've already done, and they read up on it. And then we just have this wonderful sprawling conversation, just looking at the ideas and just imagining together. And then I fuse all of that together into the episode and lead the listener through that kind of mental narrative, that process that I've been through myself, to facilitate imagining how things could be better with all of these small but mighty wins scaled up, in the hope that it'll inspire people to do the same thing, because they're all achievable. And that's what was really important to me. This is very plausible utopia building.
I love that. I love that you've transferred the skills from one niche to this new, because as you say, it is about imagination. It's about finding those things happening kind of at the hyper local level even, and then showing that actually if they did scale up, things would be very different. I am going to ask you to give us an example of that, actually. So choose, I think, have you done 6 or 7 podcasts now?
Yes, episode 6 just came out. And in that one, I wanted to focus the spotlight on youth activism, because of feeling all of that weight. And I have a teenage son, and looking at that generation growing up with that weight upon their shoulders, and it becoming an incredibly urgent crisis. And one of the really great examples in that episode, the community focus, I spoke to an amazing young woman called Destiny, who, with 2 other school friends, when they were just 17 years old, carried out this amazing campaign in South London to draw attention to air pollution. The campaign is called Choked Up. And they managed to really, really steer the conversation in the mayoral elections a few years ago, and were very heavily involved in the expansion of the ULEZ. And she was just so, I felt so energized out of that conversation with her. Another story which I love, there's Tyddon Teg, which is a community farm in Wales. They use regenerative agricultural practices, which I'm very enthusiastic about. But the thing that caught my eye with them is that they launched a community share project so that they could ensure that the farm was always held in the hands of the community, effectively, that it wasn't just one person's thing, that it was always going to be able to keep their sustainable regenerative practices, keep feeding the community. And they had a really innovative part of their share offer where they had a community solidarity fund. So people could choose to, instead of taking interest from their shares in the farm, they could donate it to a solidarity fund. And with that, Tyddon Teg can subsidise veg boxes for local families. So it isn't just the middle class wealthy families locally that benefit from this amazing food that's local. It's everybody. And that kind of thing is like, yes. That is just so beautiful. You know, economically, in terms of that structure, in terms of the practices they're using. There's a community in Wales I interviewed early on who managed to build a £1.3 million wind turbine for the benefit of their community. It was a 14-year-long struggle, but they did it. And there are so many stories in the podcast which I could enthuse about, but these are all examples of people repairing the fabric of society one tiny stitch at a time, and it's beautiful.
And so, in the episode where you were talking to those young, I mean, when really, really young, when we say young people, people think about people in their 20s. They were not even out of school when they started this, weren't they? But I know you said at one point in that podcast that you were quite overwhelmed by emotion at one point. Can you say a little bit more about that? Like, what were the feelings that you were processing when Destiny
Yeah.
was talking?
Yeah, that was a really intense experience actually, because you know what it's like when you interview people, you're focused on the questions, you're focused on the conversation, you're working on keeping the flow and the rapport. And Destiny was talking about the motivations that underpinned her campaigning and what kept her going. And we were exploring, how do you cope with this? What does it feel like to have this weight on your shoulders? And why do you do this? And she was talking about how it's all based in love. And she was talking about how she feels so much love for her community, for her family, for her friends. And so many of them are sick. So many of them are physically ill because of the air they're breathing. And that love empowers her and fuels her campaigning. And I just found myself literally crying. I just started crying because I was thinking, this is a narrative that you don't get in the mainstream press. And that's another reason behind the podcast, that these are the stories that you don't often hear about. They're not part of the narrative of be afraid now, let all of the rich people save you. It doesn't have a place in that structure. And listening to a campaigner talking about love being the basis of this, I thought was profoundly powerful and really moving. I'm just so excited to see what she goes on to achieve, because she is a really remarkable young person.
And I thought the same, just someone who's just at the start of her kind of life as an activist, just so impressive. I've got one more question for you, because we keep these chats short and sweet, as you know. Well, I got two actually. One is, please come and do some writing for us. Everything you spoke about earlier about hope and the reasons you kind of embarked on the podcast are, as you know, really what supports the work of the Resurgence Trust. It's absolutely our remit. But I have one final question for you, and this is as both an author and a mother, a family member, probably, a daughter, maybe a sister, all of those things. So you talked about in your imagining, you think, oh, what if one thing changed? So my question to you, Emma, is what is the one thing you would change if you had a magic wand? What's the one thing you would change, like tomorrow, as soon as I put that wand in your hand?
I would like to see the dismantling of capitalism. I feel that it's at the root of so many of our problems. There are so many huge problems, but it feels like that is present in every single one of them. Racism, colonialism, the destruction of the environment, the uneven distribution of resources. There's a very famous quote in the science fiction world, which I really hope I don't mess up now. I should have looked it up beforehand, but it was saying that dystopia is already here, or utopia is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. And in some ways, we get glimpses of utopia, but it's always based on the exploitation of hundreds, if not thousands of people. And if I could dismantle that structure and find a way to remove its influence from society, and hand in hand with that neoliberalism, which we've seen destroy politics over the last 40 years, all of this is coming home to roost. All of these kind of multiple crises are, I believe, as a result of the growing extremism of neoliberalism and hyper-capitalist behaviour, late-stage capitalism. If I could get rid of that, I'd be so happy. What I would replace it with, I don't know. And that's what I'm working on in my next book.
Now, and honestly, it's been such a joy to speak to you. Just tell me quickly, how can people find you? Do you have a website? How can they come and find you and your wider work? And just also, are you open to people bringing you stories for the podcast?
Yes, yes. And in fact, at the end of every episode, I invite people, if they're doing something which is similar or has the same kind of feel as what they've heard in the podcast, to email me on podcast@enewman.co.uk.
And your Newman is one N?
Yes. So emmanewman.co.uk is also my website address. Enewman.co.uk is my website. But if you just type Emma Newman author into Google, I've been around for a while, so you'll probably be able to find me. And I have a YouTube channel, and I have all kinds of things. It's quite easy to find me online. Now that social media landscape has fractured, it's probably best to go to the website, which is www.enewman.co.uk.
Emma, thank you so much. You're such a joy to speak with. Keep up the good work. We will be in touch behind scenes. I'd love to have you write for us. I know you don't have time.
Oh, no, that sounds very interesting. Yes, let's have a conversation.
But thank you so much for coming and joining this conversation this morning, and really bringing that, letting us all really know the story behind the podcast and, the motivation, the concept, what you're working hard to achieve. We really salute you, and we are behind you and with you on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you so much for reviewing the podcast. It's so hard to get the word out about new podcasts these days. There are so many. So I really appreciate it. And thank you for giving me your time today.
It's our pleasure. Okay, hope to see you soon.
Yes. Bye.